You can't breathe dirt. That's what Lena Ward's mind kept repeating as the first shovelful hit the boards above her head with a hollow thud that seemed to echo through her ribs. The sound was wrong. Too final. Too much like a coffin lid closing in a story she wasn't ready to end. She lay at the bottom of a narrow pit carved into the Oregon pine woods, wrist bound behind her back with rope that had already rubbed her skin raw, a gag tied so tight across her mouth that every attempt to scream came out as nothing more than a strangled whimper that no one would hear. Above her, through the gaps between rough-hewn planks, she could see fragments of lantern lights swinging in the darkness, casting wild shadows across the faces of three men she'd once called neighbors. Their voices filtered down to her in broken pieces, words that didn't make sense strung together with words that made too much sense. Traitor, one of them spat, and she heard the wet sound of tobacco hitting the ground. Should have known better than to trust a woman who'd nursed a savage back to health. Another voice, younger, uncertain. You sure about this, Mackay? She's just a midwife. And then the third voice, cold as creek water in January. She made her choice when she let that Modoc chief walk out of her cabin breathing. Could have let the fever take him. Could have done this territory a service. Instead, she nursed him like he was Christian folk. The second shovelful came harder, and Lena felt the boards sag slightly under the weight of displaced earth. Dust sifted through the cracks, settling on her face, catching in her eyelashes, making her blink frantically even though there was almost nothing to see anymore. The lantern light was fading, swallowed by the growing mound of dirt above, and with it went her last connection to the world of the living. She tried to shift her body, to find some angle where her lungs could expand fully, but the pit had been dug barely wider than her shoulders, and every movement only ground her bound wrists deeper into the small of her back. The claustrophobia wasn't just in her chest, it was crawling across her skin, a living thing that whispered she would die here in this hole in the ground, that no one would ever know where to find her body, that the last thing she would feel was dirt filling her mouth and nose. Her mind raced through the hours that had led to this moment. The knock on her door just after sunset, the accusations hurled at her by men whose wives she'd helped through childbirth, the rough hands that had dragged her from her cabin before she could even grab her shawl. They hadn't given her a trial, hadn't given her a chance to defend herself. In their minds, she'd already committed the unforgivable sin. She'd chosen mercy over loyalty to her own kind. But even as panic clawed at the edges of her mind, even as her body began the involuntary thrashing that comes when the animal brain realizes it's trapped, there was something else. A memory that surfaced through the terror like a hand reaching through dark water. 6 months ago, in the small cabin she'd built with her own hands after her husband died of cholera, a Modoc chief had lain on her kitchen table burning with fever, his skin so hot it seemed impossible he was still alive. She'd found him collapsed near her woodpile, miles from his people's territory, and something in her, some stubborn conviction that healing wasn't a political act, had made her drag him inside despite knowing what the men of Lost Ridge would say if they found out. For 3 days and nights she'd fought that fever with every herb and poultice she knew, with cool cloths and whispered prayers and a determination that surprised even her. She'd fed him willow bark tea for the pain, changed the dressing on an infected wound in his side, and sat beside him through the delirious hours when he'd spoken in his own language, words she couldn't understand but that sounded like names, like prayers, like the kind of things a man says when he thinks he's dying. And on the morning of the 4th day, when his eyes had finally opened clear and focused, he'd looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not gratitude exactly, though that was there. Something deeper, something that felt like recognition, as if he'd seen straight through to the part of her that had always felt like a stranger in her own settlement. Before he left, moving silent as smoke through her back door in the pre-dawn darkness, he'd pressed something into her palm. A small medicine bundle, wrapped in soft leather and decorated with beadwork in patterns that seemed to shift in the lantern light. "Keep this," he'd said in English that was better than most of the settlers spoke, his voice still rough from the fever. "If your life is ever in true danger, not fear, but the moment when death has already reached for you, this will call me back." She'd started to protest, to say she didn't need protection, that she'd only done what any healer would do. but he'd closed her fingers around it with a grip that was surprisingly strong for a man who'd been half dead hours before. You saved my life when you had every reason to let me die. That creates a debt, and I'm a man who pays his debts. Now, in the suffocating darkness of her grave, Lena's bound fingers scrabbled against the rough fabric of her dress pocket, searching with desperate intensity for that small bundle. The men above were working faster now, their conversation dying out as the grim work consumed them, and she could hear the sound changing, the hollow thud of dirt on wood becoming something softer, heavier, as the pile above the boards grew deeper. How much dirt could she survive under? How long before the weight compressed her chest until her ribs cracked, until breathing became impossible even if she did have air? Her fingers found the bundle. Even through the fabric of her pocket, she could feel its shape, could sense some quality to it that seemed to pulse against her palm like a second heartbeat. The Modoc chief's face filled her mind with startling clarity. The high, sharp planes of his cheekbones, the intelligence in his dark eyes, the way he'd looked at her as if she was someone worth knowing, worth remembering. She'd never learned his name, had been too cautious to ask in case someone discovered she'd harbored him, but now she wished she had something to call him, some way to give shape to the desperate prayer forming in her chest. More dirt cascaded through the gaps, and Lena could feel it pooling around her body now, finding every hollow and crevice, beginning to bury her from the sides as well as from above. Her lungs were burning, each breath requiring more effort than the last, and she could feel the edges of consciousness starting to fray. She thought of the medicine bundle, of the chief's promise, of the absolute certainty in his voice when he'd told her it would work. And even though every rational part of her mind said it was impossible, that he could be 100 miles away, that even if he somehow sensed a danger he'd never reach her in time, she let herself believe. She had to believe, because the alternative was accepting that this was how her story ended. Murdered by men who thought compassion was betrayal, buried in an unmarked grave for the crime of seeing humanity in someone they decided was less than human. And Lena Ward, who'd delivered 43 babies in this territory, who'd set bones and lanced infections and talked frightened mothers through their darkest hours, refused to accept that this was all her life had been building toward. The last thing she saw before the darkness became complete was a sliver of starlight through a gap in the boards. Then even that was gone, smothered by the weight of earth and men's cruelty. Aka Samish Gayabai. Outline mind Joe words die hain wo target high. Lekin main proper storytelling flow maintain karunga, and a bohat zada lamba. In a zada short summary type. Natural, engaging, all complete feel honachehi. Let me rewrite section 2 properly. 3 weeks earlier, Lena Ward had stepped off the afternoon supply wagon into Lost Ridge with nothing but a worn leather medical satchel, 2 changes of clothes, and a reputation that had preceded her by exactly 1 day. The town wasn't much to look at, a collection of half-built structures clustered around a muddy main street that would someday become a railroad depot, once the tracks finally pushed through Modoc territory. Raw lumber still smelled of sap, and you could see straight through the gaps in some building walls where carpenters had prioritized speed over craftsmanship. She'd barely set her bag down before the stairs started. Women didn't arrive alone in towns like this, not without a husband's body in a pine box or a father's name to vouch for them. The few respectable ladies she passed gathered their skirts a little tighter and whispered behind gloved hands, their eyes traveling from her practical boots to her unchaperoned status with the kind of assessment that could strip a woman's reputation bare in under 30 seconds. The boarding house had been her first stop, a sagging 2-story structure with a hand-painted sign promising clean rooms and Christian values. The proprietress, Mrs. Howell, had taken one look at Lena and shaken her head before she could even finish a question. "We don't rent to unaccompanied women. It wouldn't be proper." When Lena had pointed out that she was a widowed midwife seeking honest work, Mrs. Howell's expression had hardened. A midwife who travels alone is either running from something or looking for it. Either way, that's not the kind of clientele this establishment caters to. It had been the marshal's wife, Martha Garrison, who'd finally solved the problem. She'd approached Lena as she sat on her canvas bag in the shade of the general store, trying to decide whether to spend money on another night's wagon ride or risk sleeping under the stars. Martha was younger than Lena by maybe 5 years, with tired eyes and capable hands that suggested she knew her way around hard work. "My husband's the marshal here," she'd said without preamble. "We've got a room above the jailhouse, nothing fancy, just a cot and a washstand, but it's dry and it locks from the inside. If you're willing to tend to prisoners when they need it and maybe help me with sick folks who can't afford a doctor, we could work out a trade for lodging." The room had been exactly as advertised, narrow, with a sloped ceiling and a small window overlooking the street. But it had 4 walls and a door that bolted shut, and after 2 weeks of sleeping in wagon beds and once in a barn that smelled of wet sheep, Lena would have taken a closet. She'd moved in that same afternoon, ignoring the looks from men loitering outside the saloon who seemed to find something amusing about a woman living above a jail. Marshal Eli Garrison had been harder to read. He was tall and lean, with a weathered face that suggested he'd seen enough trouble to recognize it but hadn't lost faith in people entirely. "My wife speaks highly of your skills," he'd said when Martha introduced them. "Town could use a good midwife. We lost 2 women in childbirth last winter because the nearest doctor was 3 days' ride and the weather turned bad. If you're half as capable as Martha thinks, you'll have more work than you can handle." What he didn't say, but what Lena heard clearly in the pause that followed, was that her success would depend entirely on whether the town decided to trust her. The test came sooner than expected. 2 days after her arrival, a miner named Jonah Creek stumbled into the marshal's office with his left hand crushed between support beams in a shaft collapse. The hand was a mess, 3 fingers bent at impossible angles, the palm split open and already swelling with infection, bone visible through torn flesh. Creek was pale and sweating, his friends half-carrying him, and someone had tied a tourniquet above his elbow that was doing more harm than good. Lena had taken one look and known she had maybe an hour to save the hand. She'd cleared the marshal's desk, sent Martha running for boiled water and clean cloth, and laid Creek out flat. The pain brought him fully conscious, and she'd had 2 of his friends hold him down while she worked, cleaning the wound, setting broken bones by feel, stitching deep lacerations with precise, tiny stitches her mother had taught her years ago. She'd talked to him the whole time, her voice calm, telling him exactly what she was doing and why. When it was done, the hand splintered, wrapped, and elevated. She'd looked up to find a small crowd gathered outside, faces pressed to the window. Word traveled fast, and by evening everyone knew that the new midwife had probably saved Jonah Creek's hand and definitely saved his life. It wasn't respect exactly, not yet, but it was a crack in the wall of suspicion. The child with pneumonia came next, a miner's daughter, 6 years old, with a cough that rattled in her chest and a fever that terrified her parents. Lena spent 3 nights in their one-room cabin, teaching the mother how to ease the child's breathing, how to position her so congestion could drain. On the 4th morning, when the fever finally broke and the child asked for breakfast in a thin but steady voice, the mother had wept and pressed $2 silver into Lena's hand even though it was probably a week's wages. The drunk rancher's knife wound had been less noble but equally effective. He'd taken a blade across his forearm in a card fight at the saloon, the muscle laid open clean to bone. By the time they brought him to her, he'd sobered up enough to be scared and belligerent, cursing and pulling away every time she touched him. She'd been matter-of-fact, 4 to 2 stitches, strict instructions about keeping it clean. He'd left muttering about women who thought they were doctors, but 2 weeks later when the wound healed clean with barely a scar, he tipped his hat to her on the street. Slowly, carefully, Lena built a practice. The quiet workers came to her, ones who couldn't afford to lose wages traveling to see a proper doctor. The mothers came too, women who understood that birth was dangerous and that having someone skilled nearby might mean the difference between life and death. She delivered her first baby in Lost Ridge 3 weeks after arriving, a breech birth that should have killed both mother and child but that Lena managed to turn at the last moment. When the baby emerged squalling and healthy, the other women in the room looked at Lena with something approaching awe. But not everyone was impressed. Ephraim Pike, the railroad's local agent, watched her growing influence with cold calculation. He was a soft-bodied man with manicured hands and expensive suits that looked absurd in a town where most people wore clothes until they fell apart. He'd invited himself to sit at her table one afternoon while she ate lunch at the general store, his smile pleasant but his eyes assessing. "Miss Ward," he'd said, his voice carrying smooth Eastern Polish. "I've been hearing quite a lot about you. The miners speak highly of your skills." He paused, letting the compliment hang before continuing. "I wonder, though, if you've considered that your presence here might be temporary. The railroad is bringing civilization, proper infrastructure, real institutions. Within the year, we'll have legitimate physicians arriving, men with degrees from actual medical colleges. I'd hate to see you invest too much of yourself in a position that may not exist once qualified doctors establish their practices." The message was clear, even wrapped in courtesy. "You're useful now, but not meant to be permanent." Lena had smiled, finished her coffee, and told him she'd worry about tomorrow's competition when tomorrow arrived. She'd watched something flicker behind his eyes, irritation, maybe, or recognition that she wasn't going to be as easy to push out as he'd hoped. After that, the muttering started. Nothing overt, just whispers that followed her through the street. She was too friendly with the workers, some said. She charged too little, others complained, which was bad for business. Pike and a few associates, men who wore suits while everyone else wore dust, made sure these whispers reached the right ears, planting seeds of doubt about whether a woman operating outside proper channels could really be trusted. The tension came to a head 3 nights before the pit. She'd been invited to supper at the garrison table, a rare social occasion Martha had insisted on. The meal had been simple but good: roasted chicken, potatoes, fresh bread, and conversation pleasant enough until Marshal Garrison mentioned the Modoc. "There's been signs," he'd said carefully. "Tracks near the North Ridge, smoke from fires that might be signals. Pike's been pushing the territorial governor to send more troops. Says the railroad can't push through if there's a threat of violence." He looked at Lena, his expression unreadable. "I don't suppose any of the workers or mothers mentioned seeing Indians near town." Lena had kept her face neutral. "No one's mentioned anything to me," she'd said, which was technically true. Martha had shifted uncomfortably, and the marshal had exchanged a glance with his wife before continuing. "Pike says any contact with them makes you suspect, makes you someone who might not have the town's best interests at heart. He's been suggesting that people who help them in any way are traitors to civilization." He paused, and in that pause Lena heard the warning. "I'm telling you this as a friend, Miss Ward. The mood in this town is getting ugly. Men are scared about their jobs, about whether the railroad will get built, about whether their families are safe. When men get scared, they look for enemies, and they're not always particular about making sure they've got the right ones." The storm had been building all evening, thunder rolling across the hills like distant cannon fire, when someone started pounding on Lena's door hard enough to rattle the frame. She'd been reading by lamplight, trying to ignore the way the wind made the jailhouse creak and groan, and the urgency of those blows sent her heart straight into her throat. Nobody knocked like that unless someone was dying or someone was coming to kill you, and in a town like Lost Ridge, both possibilities felt equally likely. She'd grabbed her medical bag by instinct before she even opened the door, and found herself face to face with a boy who couldn't have been more than 15, soaking wet and breathing like he'd run miles. He was Modoc. She knew it immediately from the way he wore his hair, from the beadwork on his vest that was visible even in the dim light, from the absolute terror in his eyes that told her he knew exactly how dangerous it was for him to be standing in the middle of town after dark. His English came in broken, desperate fragments. "Please, you come. Father Chief, he dying. Fever, bad wound. Please, you help." Before Lena could answer, she heard footsteps on the stairs and Marshal Garrison appeared, his gun drawn but pointed at the floor, his face tight with the kind of tension that came from being woken by strange voices in the middle of the night. He took in the scene, the Modoc boy, Lena with her medical bag already in hand, and something shifted in his expression. Not quite resignation, but close to it, as if he'd known something like this was inevitable and had just been waiting to see how it would unfold. "Miss Ward," he said quietly, his eyes moving between her and the boy. "You know, if anyone finds out you rode out to treat one of them, there'll be trouble. Pike's already got half the town thinking you're too soft on Indians." This would be all the proof they'd need that you're not loyal to your own kind. He paused, and in that pause Lena could hear everything he wasn't saying. That trouble was a gentle word for what men like Pike would do to someone they decided was a traitor, that his safety in this town was already precarious, that crossing this line might be the thing that finally pushed the wrong people too far. But then the marshal did something unexpected. He looked at the boy, really looked at him, seeing the desperation and fear that was written across every line of his young face, and his shoulders dropped slightly. "That said," he continued, his voice even quieter now, "I'd never forgive myself if we let a man die when someone who could help was right here. And neither would Martha." He holstered his gun and met Lena's eyes. "Go, do what you do, but be back by first light, and for God's sake, be careful." Lena had saddled the fastest horse in the marshal's small stable while the boy waited, shivering and anxious, casting nervous glances down the dark street as if he expected armed men to pour out of every building. The ride out of town had been tense, the boy leading her up trails she'd never have found on her own, paths that wound through dense pine forest and across rocky outcroppings that disappeared entirely in the darkness. The storm broke properly about halfway up, rain coming down in sheets that turned the trail into a river of mud, and Lena had to trust the horse completely because she couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The Modoc camp appeared suddenly, materializing out of the darkness like something from a dream, a collection of temporary shelters tucked into a natural hollow in the forest, fires burning under stretched hides to keep the rain off, and people moving with a kind of organized purpose that came from long practice at breaking camp and moving fast when necessary. But as Lena dismounted, as the boy led her toward the largest shelter, she became acutely aware of how many eyes were on her, how many hands had moved toward weapons, how the conversation that had been happening around the fires had died into a silence that felt heavy with suspicion. The warriors who stepped into her path weren't openly hostile, but they weren't welcoming either. They spoke rapidly to the boy in their own language, their voices sharp with questions, and Lena didn't need to understand the words to know what they were asking. "Why did you bring a white woman here? How do we know she's not leading soldiers back to us? What makes you think we can trust her?" The boy argued back, gesturing toward the shelter where someone lay ill, his voice rising with frustration and fear, and the standoff might have gone on longer if a woman's voice hadn't cut through the argument with the kind of authority that silenced everyone immediately. An older woman emerged from the shelter, her face deeply lined and her hair shot through with silver, and she looked at Lena with eyes that seemed to see straight through to bone. She spoke to the warriors in a voice that left no room for argument, and whatever she said made them step aside, though their suspicion didn't ease. She beckoned Lena forward with one hand, and Lena followed her into the shelter, her heart hammering, her hands gripping her medical bag like it was a shield. The man inside was dying. Lena could see that immediately. He lay on furs and blankets, his body shaking with chills despite the fire, his breathing shallow and rapid in a way that told her his body was losing the fight against infection. He was older than she'd expected for a chief, perhaps 45 or 50, with a face that would have been handsome if it weren't gray with fever and twisted with pain. The wound was on his left side, just below his ribs, and even from the doorway Lena could smell the sweet, rotten stench of infection that meant the tissue was dying faster than his body could heal it. She'd moved on instinct then, all the fear and uncertainty falling away because this was what she knew how to do. This was the one thing she was absolutely certain about. She'd knelt beside him, opened her bag, and started giving instructions in a calm, clear voice even though she wasn't sure anyone could understand her. But the older woman had understood enough, translating rapidly, and suddenly there were hands helping her, holding the chief still as Lena cut away the bandage that someone had already applied, a poultice of some kind that had probably kept him alive this long but wasn't enough to fight the infection that had taken root. The bullet had grazed him, carving a deep furrow through the muscle but not entering the body cavity. That was the good news. The bad news was that whoever had cleaned it initially hadn't gotten all the debris out, and now the wound was filled with pus and dead tissue that needed to come out before the infection spread to his blood and killed him. Lena had worked methodically, draining the wound, cutting away the necrotic tissue, washing everything with boiled water and the strongest antiseptic she had. The chief had been barely conscious through most of it, but she felt him tense and heard him make sounds of pain that he tried to suppress, and she talked to him the same way she talked to all her patients, telling him what she was doing, why it would hurt, promising that she was trying to help even though she knew he probably couldn't understand most of her words. The fever had been the bigger battle. Once the wound was clean and packed with fresh bandages, Lena had turned her attention to bringing his temperature down, and that had meant a careful dance of blankets and fire, of cooling his skin without letting him get cold enough to go into shock. She directed people to move fires closer or farther based on his breathing, had stripped away heavy furs when his temperature spiked and piled them back on when he started shivering, had forced water down his throat a spoonful at a time because dehydration would kill him almost as fast as the infection. She'd worked through the entire night, aware of the warriors watching her from the shadows, aware that if the chief died they might decide she'd done it on purpose, aware that she was betting her life on her skills and on the hope that these people valued healing enough to give her the benefit of the doubt. The older woman had stayed close, helping when asked, watching with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and once, just once, she touched Lena's shoulder and said something in her own language that sounded almost like approval. When the fever finally broke, it happened suddenly. One moment the chief was burning up, shaking with chills that seemed like they'd never stop, and the next his breathing had evened out, his skin had cooled, and he'd fallen into what looked like actual sleep instead of the semi-conscious delirium he'd been trapped in all night. Lena had sat back on her heels, exhausted, her hands shaking slightly from hours of tension, and watched the sun start to rise through the gaps in the shelter, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. That's when his eyes had opened, clear, focused, fully aware. And without warning, his hand had shot out and gripped her wrist with surprising strength for a man who'd been at death's door hours before. He'd said something in his own language, his voice rough but steady, and the older woman had translated. He says you are sister of life, that you came when others would not, that this creates a debt that must be honored. Then the chief, Toskani, she learned later, though at that moment she still didn't know his name, had reached beneath the fairs and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in soft leather. It was beautiful in a way that spoke of careful craftsmanship and deep meaning, decorated with beadwork in patterns that seemed to shift in the firelight, and when he pressed it into her hand his grip was firm and his eyes were intense. The older woman translated again. If ever your life hangs by a thread, if death has already reached for you and you have nowhere left to turn, burn this. The smoke will call us. The Modoc will answer. This is sworn before witnesses. This is a life debt declared. Lena had wanted to protest, to say she'd only done what any healer would do. But something in his expression stopped her. This wasn't a casual thank you or a polite gesture. This was something that mattered deeply in his culture, something he needed to give as much as he thought she might someday need to receive. So she closed her fingers around the bundle, nodded once, and said simply, I hope I never need to use it, but I'll keep it safe. The ride back to town as dawn broke had been surreal. Lena had felt disconnected from her body, running on nothing but exhaustion and nervous energy, the medicine bundle tucked deep in her satchel where no one could see it. She wasn't sure she believed in it, wasn't sure she believed that burning a bundle of herbs and carved bone could summon help across miles of territory, but she also couldn't bring herself to throw it away. It felt important. It felt like a promise that deserved to be honored, even if she never understood exactly how it was supposed to work. She'd made it back to the jailhouse just as the town was waking up, slipping the horse back into the stable and climbing the stairs to her room before anyone but the marshal knew she'd been gone. And for 3 days, it had seemed like maybe she'd gotten away with it, like maybe no one would ever know where she'd really been that stormy night. But in a town like Lost Ridge, secrets never stayed buried for long. Someone had seen her leave. Someone had talked. And 3 nights later, when rough hands had dragged her from her cabin and thrown her into that pit in the woods, she'd understood with terrible clarity that Toskani's gift hadn't been paranoia or superstition. It had been prophecy. For 3 days after that stormy night, Lena had allowed herself to believe the secret was buried. She'd gone about her work with careful normalcy, delivering a baby for a prospector's wife, treating a teamster's infected tooth, restocking her dwindling supply of laudanum, and told herself that the chapter was closed, that whatever debt Toskani felt he owed her would remain an unspoken understanding between two people who'd never see each other again. But in a town like Lost Ridge, secrets had a way of clawing their way to the surface, and the first sign that hers was rising came when the blacksmith's wife crossed to the other side of the street rather than past Lena on the boardwalk. It was a small thing, easily dismissed as coincidence or personal preoccupation. But then the general store clerk had hesitated before filling her order for supplies, his eyes sliding away from hers as if direct contact might contaminate him. And then Mrs. Patterson from the church had physically snatched her 5-year-old daughter's hand and pulled her back when the child had started to approach Lena outside the post office, whispering something sharp that made the girl's eyes go wide with fear. By the fourth day, someone had scrawled Indian Lover across the jailhouse wall in crude white paint, the letters dripping like accusations, and Lena had understood with sinking certainty that someone had talked, that the story of her midnight ride had spread through Lost Ridge like cholera through a mining camp. The whispers followed her everywhere now. She could feel them prickling against her back when she walked down the street, could see them in the way conversations died when she entered a room, could hear them in the forced politeness of people who'd been warm to her just days before. Someone saw her riding toward the hills with a painted boy she'd overheard outside the saloon. Middle of the night, during that storm. What kind of Christian woman does that? The question had been rhetorical, the answer already decided in the speaker's mind, and Lena had kept walking with her chin up and her face neutral even though her stomach had twisted with fear. Ephraim Pike had waited almost a week before making his move, letting the town's suspicion simmer and build until it was primed for his intervention. He'd found her in the small room behind the general store that served as her clinic when the jailhouse was too public, coming through the door without knocking as if he owned every space in town by virtue of the money he represented. His smile had been thin and controlled, the expression of a man who knew he held all the cards and was enjoying the moment before he laid them on the table. "Miss Ward," he'd said, his voice carrying that smooth Eastern Polish that now made her skin crawl. "I wonder if we might have a frank conversation about your recent activities." He'd settled himself in the only chair without waiting for invitation, crossing his legs with careful precision, his expensive suit looking absurd in the rough surroundings. "There are rumors circulating, nothing I put much stock in personally, you understand, but rumors nonetheless that you've been consulting for the enemy, that you rode out to provide medical assistance to the very savages who've been raiding our supply wagons and threatening the progress of civilization in this territory." Lena had kept her hands busy organizing instruments on the small table that served as a work surface, not trusting herself to look at him directly. "I'm a healer, Mr. Pike. I go where I'm needed, regardless of who needs me. That's not political. That's medicine." Pike's smile had widened slightly, as if she'd said something amusing. "But you see, Miss Ward, everything is political when there's a war on. And make no mistake, this is a war, even if it hasn't been officially declared. The railroad investors are furious about the repeated raids on our wagons. 3 in the last month alone, supply lines disrupted, valuable equipment stolen or destroyed. And there are those who suggest these attacks might be coordinated with inside help, that perhaps someone is providing information about wagon schedules and routes to those who would use that information to harm American interests." The accusation had hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear as daylight, and Lena had finally turned to face him, her jaw tight. "Are you accusing me of something, Mr. Pike? Because if you are, I'd appreciate you being direct about it instead of hiding behind insinuation." He'd studied her for a long moment, his eyes calculating, and then had leaned forward slightly, dropping his voice to something that might have passed for concern if you didn't look too closely at his face. "I'm offering you a way out, Miss Ward. The situation in this town is deteriorating rapidly. Men are angry, frightened, looking for someone to blame for their troubles. And right now, that someone appears to be you." He'd reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, laying it on the table between them with the delicacy of someone handling something precious. "This is a statement. It names certain troublemaking ranchers who've been vocal about their opposition to the railroad's expansion, and it identifies one particular Modoc scout who's been seen near town on multiple occasions. All you have to do is sign it, confirming that you've witnessed contact between these individuals, and I'll make sure you're kept safe. More than safe, I'll arrange for your relocation back east, with enough money to set yourself up properly in a real city where your skills would be appreciated by the right sort of people." Lena had picked up the paper with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear but from pure anger. She'd scanned the names. Men she knew, some of whom she'd treated, none of whom she had any reason to believe were collaborating with anyone. It was fiction dressed up as testimony, a convenient narrative that would give Pike exactly the justification he needed to eliminate opposition to the railroad's plans and to paint the Modoc as orchestrated threats rather than desperate people defending their territory. "This is a lie," she'd said flatly, dropping the paper back on the table as if it burned her fingers. "I won't sign it. I won't lie to hang innocent people just to save my own skin." The change in Pike had been immediate and startling. The polite mask had slipped, revealing something cold and calculating underneath, and when he'd stood up his movement had been sharp enough to make Lena take an involuntary step back. "Then you're a fool," he'd said, his voice stripped of all pretense of civility. "You think your principles will protect you? You think being right matters when a mob decides you're the enemy? When this town finally breaks, and it will break, Miss Ward, I'll make certain of that, it will be looking for a traitor to blame. And you've made yourself the perfect candidate." He'd moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at her with something that might have been pity if it weren't so clearly contempt. "You had a chance to walk away clean. Remember that when they come for you." The door had closed behind him with a soft click that somehow felt more threatening than if he'd slammed it, and Lena had stood in the sudden silence feeling like the walls were closing in. She'd wanted to run to Marshal Garrison, to tell him everything Pike had said, but what could she really report? That Pike had offered her money to sign a false statement? That he'd threatened her with vague consequences if she didn't comply? In a territory where the railroad represented progress and prosperity, where Pike's word carried the weight of Eastern money and political connections, who would believe her accusations against him? That night, Marshal Eli had come to her room above the jailhouse just after dark, his face grave and his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry through the thin walls. "There's a posse forming," he'd said without preamble. "Another supply wagon went missing this afternoon, and Pike's been whipping people up into a fury about it. Says it's proof that the Modoc are getting bolder, that they must have help from inside the town." He'd met her eyes, and she'd seen the worry there, the helpless anger of a man who could see what was coming but couldn't figure out how to stop it. "Lena, I need you to understand how serious this is. Pike's not just making trouble. He's orchestrating something. I think he's arranging both the raids and the blame, setting up a situation where he can justify bringing in military force and clearing out anyone who stand in the railroad's way. But I can't prove it, and even if I could, I'm not sure it would matter at this point." Lena had nodded slowly, her mind working through possibilities and finding nothing but dead ends. If Pike was manufacturing the raids, either paying someone to stage them or simply lying about their frequency, then he controlled the narrative completely. And if the town was primed to believe that narrative, desperate for someone to blame for their fear and economic uncertainty, then proof might not matter at all. Mobs didn't operate on evidence. They operated on emotion, on the need to feel like they were taking action, on the terrible comfort of having a clear enemy to destroy. After the marshal left, Lena had sat on her narrow cot in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the town settling in for the night. Distant laughter from the saloon, a dog barking somewhere down the street, the creak of wagon wheels on rutted roads. Her hand had found its way to her medical bag almost without conscious thought, her fingers searching until they touched the small leather bundle that Toskani had pressed into her palm. She'd pulled it out and held it up to the moonlight coming through her window, studying the intricate beadwork that formed patterns she couldn't read, feeling the weight of it in her hand like a promise she wasn't sure she believed in. Superstition and folk magic had never been things Lena put much faith in. She believed in science, in medicine that could be tested and proven, in cause and effect that followed logical rules. But sitting there in the darkness, knowing that Pike was moving against her and that she had no allies with enough power to stop him, she found herself wondering if maybe superstition was all she had left. If maybe sometimes the world operated on rules that couldn't be measured in a laboratory, on debts and promises that existed outside the realm of rational thought. She tucked the bundle back into her bag, but she'd left it near the top this time, easily accessible, just in case the moment came when burning it was the only option she had left. The peace meeting had been doomed from the start, though Lena hadn't realized it until the first shot cracked through the evening air like the breaking of the world. The territorial governor had arranged it, a neutral gathering on the edge of town where representatives from Lost Ridge could sit across from a Modoc delegation and discuss terms that might prevent further bloodshed. Marshal Garrison had been cautiously optimistic. Martha had baked bread as a gesture of goodwill, and Lena had stood in the back of the assembled crowd feeling the tension vibrate through the air like heat off summer stone. Toskani had been there, standing with 4 other men, his face carefully neutral as Pike and 2 railroad officials spoke about mutually beneficial arrangements and peaceful coexistence contingent on cooperation. Lena had caught his eye once, briefly, and seen something there she couldn't quite name. Warning, maybe, or resignation, as if he already knew how this would end. And then someone in the crowd, a jumpy miner who'd been drinking, people said later, though that didn't matter much in the moment, had seen one of the Modoc men shift his weight and had interpreted it as reaching for a weapon. The shot had gone wild, hitting nothing, but it had shattered whatever fragile possibility the meeting had held. The Modoc delegation had vanished into the trees with the kind of speed that came from generations of knowing how to disappear, and the crowd had erupted into chaos, people shouting, women screaming, men running for their guns. And through it all, Pike's voice had cut like a blade, loud and clear and absolutely certain. This is exactly what happens when you feed them information. They come right to our doorstep because someone told them it was safe, because someone made them think they had friends here. He pointed directly at Lena then, his fingers stabbing the air like an accusation. If she hadn't been treating them, nursing them, giving them reason to think we were weak, this never would have happened. The crowd had turned to look at her with eyes that held no questions, only confirmation of what they'd already decided was true. Lena had felt the weight of their judgment like physical pressure, had seen in their faces that no defense she could offer would matter, that Pike had successfully positioned her as the explanation for all their fear and uncertainty. Marshal Garrison had stepped forward, trying to talk sense, but his voice had been drowned out by the rising anger, and Martha had gripped Lena's arm and whispered urgently, "Go home. Lock your door. Stay inside until this blows over." But it hadn't blown over. It had gotten worse. By nightfall, someone had thrown a rock through her clinic window, and the threatening notes had started appearing, crude messages scrawled on torn paper and shoved under her door, telling her to leave town or face consequences, calling her traitor and worse things that made her hands shake when she read them. She'd stayed in the clinic anyway, stubborn or stupid or both, organizing her supplies with trembling fingers and trying to convince herself that the law would protect her, that even in a place as rough as Lost Ridge there were still rules that mattered. She'd been closing up, packing away the last of her instruments by lamplight, when they'd come through the door. 3 men, faces covered with bandanas, moving with the coordinated purpose of people who'd planned this carefully. She'd opened her mouth to scream, and one of them had stuffed a rag into it, gagging her so efficiently she knew he'd done this before. Rough hands had grabbed her arms, wrenching them behind her back, and she'd felt rope bite into her wrists as they bound her with quick, professional knots. One of them, the biggest, with a voice she almost recognized, had leaned close and whispered, "Mr. Pike sends his regards. Says you had your chance." They'd force her onto a wagon that was waiting in the alley behind the clinic, shoving her down onto the bed and covering her with a tarp that smelled of machine oil and dirt. If anyone saw them, and someone must have, because this was still the middle of town, it would have looked like a prisoner transport, official business. Nothing to question. Lena had tried to fight, had twisted and kicked and made every muffled sound she could manage through the gag, but they'd handled her with the casual efficiency of men moving cargo, and within minutes the wagon was rolling, the town lights fading behind them as they headed into the darkness of the surrounding forest. That's when true terror had set in. This wasn't an arrest. This wasn't even rough justice or a warning meant to scare her into leaving. This was a disappearance, the kind of thing that happened in territories where law was more suggestion than reality, where inconvenient people simply vanished and nobody looked too hard for answers. Through the tarp, she could hear fragments of their conversation, casual talk about weather and wages, as if they were doing ordinary work, as if the bound woman in their wagon was just another job to complete before heading home for supper. Lena's mind raced through possibilities and found nothing but dead ends. No one knew where she was. The marshal thought she was safely locked in her clinic. Martha probably assumed she'd taken the earlier advice and was lying low. By the time anyone realized she was missing, these men would have finished whatever Pike had paid them to do, and her body would be somewhere no one would ever think to look. The thought made something break loose inside her chest, made panic claw up her throat even though the gag meant she couldn't give it voice. But even through the panic, even as her body thrashed uselessly against the ropes and the torp and the casual certainty of her own death, a different kind of thought was forming. The medicine bundle. It was in her satchel, and her satchel was pressed against her side where she'd been holding it when they grabbed her. Could she reach it? With her hands bound behind her back, with the wagon jolting over rough terrain, with every movement potentially alerting the men driving the wagon, she'd started working slowly, carefully, using her bound fingers to feel for the buckle on her satchel, grateful that it was old leather that gave slightly under pressure. The wagon hit a rut and she used the jolt to cover her movement, her fingers finding the buckle and working it open with agonizing slowness. The men were talking louder now, something about how much they were getting paid, about how Pike was cleaning up loose ends before the real railroad money arrived. Their voices covered the small sound she was making as her fingers searched the interior of her bag, pushing past bottles and bandages, searching for that distinctive shape wrapped in soft leather. Her fingers found it just as the wagon started to slow. She palmed it, clutching it in her bound hands as they pulled her from the wagon, and she saw where they'd brought her, a clearing in the pine woods, far enough from any trail that no one would stumble across it, with a pit already dug in the earth like a wound in the forest floor. One of the men held a lantern while the others hauled her toward it, and she realized with absolute, crystalline clarity that this was the moment Toskani had foreseen, the death he'd promised to answer if she called. They shoved her into the pit and she fell hard, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. Above her, they were already positioning rough planks across the opening, blocking out the stars, and in the narrow space of those final seconds Lena did the only thing she could. She twisted her bound hands toward the lantern light that filtered down through the cracks, crushed the medicine bundle between her palms until she felt it break open, and rubbed it desperately against a splinter of wood that had caught fire from the lantern, still smoldering at the edge of the pit. The bundle caught, releasing a thin trail of bitter-smelling smoke, sage and something else, something that made her eyes water, and she angled her hands toward the widest crack between the planks, praying that even a thread of that smoke would escape before they sealed her in completely. Through the gap she could hear them clearly now, their voices casual as they discussed her disappearance. We'll say she ran off with Indian gold, that she was working with them all along and finally took her cut. Pike's already got people ready to swear they saw her packing up. Nobody will look too hard anyway. Town's already decided she's a traitor. Be easier for everyone if she's just gone. The first shovelful of dirt hit the boards above her head with that terrible, final sound, and Lena felt darkness closing in from all sides, the physical darkness of the pit and the deeper darkness of knowing she might die here with no one ever knowing the truth. But even as the dirt began to rain down through the cracks, even as her lungs started to bane and her consciousness began to fray at the edges, Lena held on to one thought with desperate intensity. The smoke had escaped. She'd seen it curl upward through the gap, had watched it catch the wind and drift toward the hills where Toskani's people might still be camped. It was a thin hope, as fragile as smoke itself, but it was all she had. So she focused on the memory of Toskani's eyes when he'd pressed the bundle into her hand, on the absolute certainty in his voice when he promised the Modoc would answer, and she let herself believe, had to believe, that a life debt sworn before witnesses meant something stronger than the dirt and boards and cruel intentions of men who thought they could bury truth as easily as they buried a body. The smoke reached the Modoc camp just after moonrise, carried on a wind that twisted through the pine valleys with a kind of persistence that felt less like weather and more like intention. Toskani had been sitting before the council fire, listening to the elders debate whether to move camp again or stay and risk another confrontation with the railroad's men, when he'd seen the young scout, a boy named Chaska who'd been standing watch on the eastern ridge, come running down the slope with his face tight with urgency. "Chief," the boy had gasped, breathing hard from the sprint. "There's smoke. Not cookfire smoke, not wildfire. Something else. Bitter smell, like the old ceremonies. It's drifting low through the trees, following the roots." He'd held out his hand, and in his palm was a small piece of charred leather, edges still glowing faintly, beadwork half melted but still recognizable. "Found this caught in a bush." The smoke was coming from the direction of the white settlement. Toskani had taken the scrap with hands that trembled slightly, though his face remained impassive. He'd known immediately what it was. Knew it the way you know your own heartbeat, the way you recognize the voice of someone who saved your life. The medicine bundle he'd given to the healer woman, the promise he'd sealed before witnesses, the debt he'd hoped would never need to be called in but had prepared for anyway because honor wasn't something you practiced only when it was convenient. She was in danger, true danger, the kind where death had already reached for her, exactly as he'd specified when he'd made that promise. He'd stood abruptly, and the conversation around the fire had died as all eyes turned to him. "The debt has been called," he'd said simply, holding up the burned scrap so everyone could see it. "The woman who saved my life is dying. We ride now." The reaction had been immediate and divided. Toskani, one of the senior warriors, had stepped forward with his jaw set and his eyes hard. "Chief, we can't risk riding toward Lost Ridge. Not now. The failed peace meeting has them stirred up like hornets, and Pike's men are looking for any excuse to justify bringing in the cavalry. If we ride toward the settlement and they see us, they'll cut us down before we can explain why we're there. You will be leading warriors to their deaths for one white woman who knew the risks when she helped us." Others had murmured agreement, and Toskani had seen the fear and calculation in their eyes, not cowardice, but the practical mathematics of survival that every leader in occupied territory had to master. How many lives was one life worth? How much could they risk for someone who wasn't Modoc, who'd made her choice knowing it might cost her exactly this? These were reasonable questions, the kind that kept people alive when the margin between survival and extinction was measured in careful decisions and strategic retreats. But Toskani had shaken his head slowly, his voice cutting through the murmurs with a kind of authority that came not from volume but from absolute certainty. "A promise like this doesn't bind just a man. It binds a people's honor. When I told her the Modoc would answer, I spoke for all of us. If we ignore this call, if we let her die because answering is dangerous, then what are we? What does our word mean?" He turned to look at each warrior in turn, meeting their eyes and holding them. "She crossed that invisible line to save my life. She had no guarantee of safety, no promise that my people wouldn't kill her for being white, no way to know if I would even survive. She did it anyway because she saw a man who needed healing and decided that was enough. Now the line runs the other way, and I will cross it, with warriors behind me or alone. But I will cross it." The silence that followed had stretched long enough that Toskani had begun to think he might truly ride alone, that even his authority as chief wasn't enough to overcome the reasonable fear of suicide by proxy. But then Toskani had stepped forward again, and this time when he spoke his voice carried resignation instead of argument. "If we're doing this, we do it smart. Small group, fast horses, stay off the main trails. We track the smoke source, find her, and get out before Pike's people even know we were there." Within minutes, 6 warriors had been mounted and ready, their faces painted for speed rather than war, carrying only the weapons they could use from horseback. They followed the smoke's path backward, reading the wind and the way the scent clung to low branches and settled into hollows where the air moved slowly. Toskani had led them with single-minded focus, his eyes scanning the ground for the signs he knew would be there. Disturbed earth, wagon ruts too fresh to have been there more than hours, the kind of tracks that spoke of men moving with purpose in the dark. They'd found the pine clearing just before midnight, the moon high enough to paint everything in silver and shadow. The wagon ruts led straight to a patch of disturbed ground, and even from horseback Toskani could see the signs of recent digging. Loose dirt that hadn't settled yet, a shovel abandoned at the edge of the trees as if the men who'd used it had been in too much of a hurry to care about covering all their tracks. His chest had tightened with a fear he hadn't allowed himself to feel during the ride. because now he was looking at what might be a grave, and graves meant they were already too late. He dismounted in silence, the other warriors spreading out to form a perimeter, watching the tree line for any sign that Pike's men might have left someone behind to guard their work. Toskani had approached the disturbed earth slowly, dropping to his knees at the edge and pressing his hands flat against the loose dirt, feeling for any sign of what lay beneath. The others had watched him with expressions that ranged from hope to resignation, understanding that the next few moments would determine whether this ride had been an act of honor or a pointless risk that would haunt them for years. Then Toskani had lowered his head, pressing his ear directly against the ground the way his grandfather had taught him to listen for distant horses, for underground water, for the things that spoke in vibrations too subtle for ordinary hearing. At first there was nothing, just the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, the whisper of wind through pine branches, the distant call of a night bird. But then, so faint he almost convinced himself he was imagining it, he'd heard it, a rhythmic thud, weak and irregular but definitely there. Something alive. Someone alive. Still fighting even though the earth itself had been piled on top of her. Still refusing to surrender even when surrender would have been easier than the agony of slow suffocation. Toskani had raised his hand sharply, and every warrior had frozen, understanding the gesture meant silence, meant pay attention, meant something crucial was happening. He'd lifted his head and met Takota's eyes across the clearing, and whatever the older warrior saw in his face made him move immediately, dropping to his knees and beginning to claw at the loose dirt with his bare hands even before the order was given. The digging had been frantic, desperate, 6 pairs of hands clawing through dirt and tearing at boards with an urgency that came from knowing every second mattered. When they finally hauled Lena out, she'd been limp and barely breathing, her face gray in the moonlight, dirt caked in her hair and around her mouth where the gag had pressed. Toskani had cradled her head while one of the warriors forced water past her cracked lips, and for several terrifying moments he'd thought they'd arrived just seconds too late, that the promise would end in failure despite everything they'd risked. But then she'd coughed, a weak, rattling sound that brought dirt and bile with it, and her eyes had opened, unfocused and confused but alive. Relief had washed through Toskani with such force he'd had to close his eyes for a moment, had to steady himself against the weight of what they'd almost lost. Takota had started to suggest they take her back to camp where the healers could tend to her properly, but Toskani had shaken his head with immediate certainty. No, he'd said, his voice hard with decision. We take her toward Lost Ridge. If justice is to mean anything, it has to be witnessed where the crime began. The people who did this need to see that we know, that we came, that the debt was real. It was a risk. Riding straight toward the settlement at dawn with a barely conscious white woman would look like either rescue or kidnapping depending on who saw them first, and in the current climate either interpretation could get them killed. But Toskani had understood something fundamental. Unless this was made public, unless the truth was exposed in front of witnesses who couldn't ignore it, Pike would spin whatever story served him best and Lena's attempted murder would disappear into rumor and speculation. They'd ridden slowly as dawn broke, Lena draped across Toskani's saddle, semi-conscious and making small sounds of pain with each breath. By the time they reached the edge of town, the sun was painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, and people were starting to emerge from buildings, beginning their morning routines. The first person to see the Modoc riders had been a merchant opening his store, and his shout of alarm had brought people running, some grabbing rifles, others simply staring in confusion at the impossible sight of armed Modoc warriors riding calmly down the main street carrying what looked like a body. Marshal Eli Garrison had pushed through the gathering crowd with his gun drawn but pointed at the ground, his face tight with the kind of tension that came from knowing one wrong move could turn this into a massacre. But when he'd gotten close enough to see who the woman was, when he'd recognized Lena's dirt-caked face and torn dress, his expression had shifted from professional caution to personal horror. "Dear God," he'd breathe, holstering his weapon and moving forward with his hands raised to show he meant no threat. What happened? Who did this? Toskani had dismounted carefully, lifting Lena down with a gentleness that seemed impossible from a man his size, and had laid her on the ground in the middle of the street where everyone could see. The crowd had grown larger now, people pressing closer, Martha Garrison pushing through with tears already streaming down her face, and Toskani had straightened to his full height and addressed them all in English that carried clearly in the morning air. 3 nights ago, this woman saved my life, he'd said, his voice cutting through the murmurs and gasps. She came when I was dying, when no one else would, and she asked nothing in return except that I remember what she did. Last night, smoke called me, the sacred smoke of a promise kept. We tracked it here and found her buried alive in the pine woods, left to suffocate in the dark by men who wanted her silence more than they wanted justice. He'd paused, letting his words sink in, seeing the shock and confusion on faces that had been so certain of Lena's guilt just days before. I am Toskani, chief of the Modoc people who have lived in these hills since before your grandfathers were born. And I am telling you that this woman is worth more than every lie you have been told about her. The crowd had erupted in voices, some demanding proof, others asking who would do such a thing, still others muttering that this was Modoc trickery, that they couldn't trust anything being said. But Marshal Garrison had raised his hand for silence, his face set with the kind of grim determination that came from a man who'd finally had enough of dancing around truth. Someone get Doc Willis to tend to her, he'd ordered, then had turned to face the crowd. And someone needs to explain to me right now why there are fresh wagon tracks leading from the back of Miss Ward Clinic to a burial site in the woods. Because if what Chief Toskani says is true, we've got a murder to investigate. That's when Pike had made his mistake. He'd been standing in the back of the crowd, probably calculating whether he could slip away unnoticed, but something in the marshal's words had made him react, a flicker of expression, a half-step backward that caught Garrison's eye. Mr. Pike, the marshal had said slowly, his hand moving back toward his holstered gun. You wouldn't happen to know anything about Miss Ward's disappearance, would you? Pike's face had smoothed into careful blankness, but his eyes had been darting, looking for exits, for allies, for any way out of the trap that was closing around him. I'm sure I don't know what you're implying, Marshal. I've been in town all night, working on railroad correspondence. If Miss Ward met with some unfortunate accident, I'm as shocked as anyone. But his voice had carried a note of desperation that undermined the words, and when one of his hired men, the youngest one, the one who'd hesitated during the kidnapping, had started backing away from the group with guilt written across every line of his face, the whole story had begun to unravel. Don't, the young man had said, his voice shaking. Don't make me the only one who hangs for this. Pike paid us. Said she was a traitor, said the railroad needed her gone, said it was for the good of the territory. He turned to face Pike directly, his fear giving way to anger. You said nobody would care. You said she was already as good as dead in people's minds. But you didn't say nothing about burying her alive. That wasn't part of the deal. The crowd's mood had shifted instantly, confusion becoming fury, and Pike must have seen it in their faces, seen that whatever authority he'd held through money and position had just evaporated, that he was now the target instead of Lena. He'd grabbed for the gun at his belt, a panicked movement that was more reflex than strategy, and several people had screamed and scattered. But Marshal Garrison had been faster, his own weapon coming up smooth and practiced, and the single shot he'd fired had echoed through the morning air like judgment. Pike had fallen in the street, the gun tumbling from his hand, and nobody had moved to help him as his blood soaked into the dust. Justice in the territories was often ugly and immediate, and whatever complicated feelings people might have had about whether the law had been properly followed, there was a collective sense that the right person had finally paid the right price. The months that followed had been ones of careful, uncertain healing, both for Lena and for the relationship between Lost Ridge and the Modoc people. The clinic had been Lena's idea, built on neutral ground halfway between the settlement and the nearest Modoc camp, a simple structure that belonged to neither community and therefore could serve both. She trained a young Modoc woman named Iona in the techniques she'd learned from her mother and from years of frontier medicine, and Iona had taught Lena about the healing herbs that grew in the mountain valleys, about setting broken bones using methods that predated European settlement by centuries. On the day the narrator's story closed, children were playing outside the clinic in the afternoon sun, Modoc and settler children together, not yet old enough to carry the full weight of their people's complicated history, still young enough to see each other as potential friends rather than inherited enemies. Toskani stood nearby talking with Marshal Garrison about joint patrols, about sharing information on bandits and rustlers who preyed on both communities, about building something that might, over time, begin to resemble actual peace rather than just the absence of immediate violence. Lena watched them from the clinic doorway, her hand unconsciously touching the spot on her side where the rope burns had finally healed, where she still sometimes woke in the night feeling phantom doubt pressing down on her chest. The day she'd been buried alive had also been the day something deeper was unearthed, an understanding that mercy remembered was stronger than hatred inherited, that promises kept could build bridges across divide that violence had spent generations widening. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even easy. But it was real, and it was growing, and that was more than anyone had dared hope for in the dark hours before dawn when Smoke had carried a desperate prayer through the pine trees and found someone who remembered that honor was worth the risk.